Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Africa 360. I'm your host, Kwangu Liwewe. The African diaspora is large, numbering an estimated 140 million people. It includes those who have lived outside the continent for generations and those who migrated in recent decades. This week on Africa 360, we look at migration and the journey many Africans undertake in search for a better life.
Clad in white shorts, golfers casually tee off. In the distance, about a dozen migrants are trying to scale the fence that separates Morocco from the Spanish enclave of Melilla. After crossing miles of desert, risking detention every step of the way, in the end, this 6-meter-tall razor wire barrier is all that separates scores of desperate migrants from Europe.
I hid my money in my top and put my telephone in my underpants. I attached hooks to my hands. We shouted, "Now is the time, let's go." And 200 of us charged and started running to the fence.
Others opt for crossing the Mediterranean into Europe, but many don't survive the treacherous waters. In 2014, more than 150,000 migrants, mostly from Africa and the Middle East, attempted to cross the Mediterranean. An estimated 3,000 died along the way. It's a responsibility Europe seems less inclined to bear in 2015. The Italian search and rescue ship, the Mare Nostrum, has retired its sails, citing financial strain. It's been replaced by an EU-backed assignment limited to security operations along the coast, with ministers saying search and rescue missions only further encourage illegal immigration.
The focus will now shift towards enhancing the concrete implementation of our commonly agreed priorities. First, strengthening the link between migration and development, and second, prevention of and fight against irregular migration.
But will the lack of a search and rescue fleet on Mediterranean waters really act as a deterrent?
I think migration cannot really be stopped, let's put it this way. And as long as a coordinated effort, both to address the issues of push-pull factor, but also the criminal justice side, the smuggling networks are in place, the fact that the rescue missions are stopped will not does not mean that there will not be more migrants coming through that dangerous route.
Immigration has become a major political issue in Europe, with some groups calling for tougher policies. Following the terror attack on French magazine Charlie Hebdo, far-right leader Marine Le Pen was among the first to unequivocally blame the attack on Islamic fundamentalism, a move that may stoke anti-immigrant feelings.
We must not stay silent, and we must say what happened. We must not be scared of words. This is a terrorist act committed in the name of radical Islamism.
With tighter immigration control and growing anti-immigration sentiment, those seeking to enter Europe will find it harder in 2015. But it might not stop them from trying.
For some perspective on this, I'm now joined by our guests. A warm welcome to Professor Ingrid Palmary, who is the Director of the African Center for Migration and Society, and Bernado Mariano, who is Southern Africa's Regional Director at the International Organization for Migration. Thank you both for joining me. Bernado, I'll start with you. We've been seeing, especially in the media, lots of Africans in their hundreds trying to get to the shores of Europe, actually in their droves. We've been seeing these images that are showing us Africans striving to get there. Just put this into perspective for us. Is this really what the situation is like in terms of people leaving the continent?
I think we need to maybe first make a difference between excess migration to Europe, which is not the case. It's not a crisis of excess migrants moving to Europe. It is an issue of humanitarian assistance, migrants needing protection, and a crisis of migrants that require support as they look for a better life. In any case, the number of migrants crossing the Mediterranean is increasing. And it's not increasing because of policies of government. It's increasing because of the conflicts that we see in Syria and other places that push factors that push migrants to actually look for better, safer places. So I think we need to look from that perspective as well.
Now, apart from conflict, we've mentioned, what else is a push factor for Africans seeking either refuge or something else in Europe?
Well, in Europe, we see different migration patterns, and like in other parts of Africa, it's driven in part by conflict, in part by economic opportunity and the need for better work, as well as other kinds of migration, study, etc. So it's a real combination that we see.
Now, when we look at Europe, of course, we've seen the springing up of right-wing anti-immigration groups in different countries on that continent. How is this fueling, let's say, racism in these places?
I think generally in the world we see an increased anti-migrant sentiment. It's an increase. And of course, the sad part of all that is when politicians use that to gain some sympathy or votes with their constituencies by fueling more anti-migrant sentiment. I think that's the sad part.
And if we look at refugees and asylum seekers who are looking for refuge in other countries, they are obviously putting a strain on public services in those countries. How does one begin to deal with that?
Well, I'm not sure that that's obvious. I think that there are aspects of migration that can have positive and negative effects. If you look at refugees and asylum seekers in particular, very often those who do manage to leave, particularly those who travel very far distances, are those who do have some resources and some skills and some networks that can often be extremely valuable for a host society. So it's not that it's necessarily bad. A lot of it comes down to who's leaving and how the migration is managed when it happens.
But what about the public services of these countries? A lot of countries are complaining that in terms of education, because they obviously give them free education, free health, and some allowances in some countries. Isn't this having an impact on their public services?
The question here is, shouldn't the state or the government plan for that? And what is the government doing to plan for the increase of migration? And what we have actually, what we see actually is the other way around, where public services are planned in for the local population without taking consideration of the foreign population living in that particular community. So that can trigger, of course, conflicts and service delivery issues. But my call and from IOM perspective, the call is include migrant population in urban planning, in all the municipality planning, especially in areas where there is a high percentage of migrants.
Well, Bernardo, hold on to that thought, because now let's take a look at who exactly is leaving the continent. Well, as this graphic shows, the main sources of international refugees are Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Eritrea, Central African Republic, Angola, Rwanda, and Burundi. Ingrid, if we take a look at these countries, what do they have in common?
Well, of course, conflict is a major motivator for the movement of people from many of those countries. What I would say is that it's quite useful, though, to also break it down. This is, of course, a global or at least a continent-wide picture. And it's really important that, for example, the number of Sudanese refugees to neighboring countries would be much higher, but perhaps far less to somewhere like South Africa. So it does have different dynamics in different parts of the continent, but certainly conflict is a major driver of movement from these countries.
And in terms of political instability and conflict, really, what can we as Africans or even the African Union do to contain these large numbers of refugees leaving the continent?
I think, first of all, stability. Of course, political stability, economic development. It's all, as Ingrid said, it is about security in terms of safety of the population of these countries. When if the country is developing, for instance, let's take Angola. I mean, there were lots of Angolan refugees in South Africa, in Zambia, and a lot of them went back. So we work with UNHCR to repatriate Angolans back to Angola because the situation in Angola has improved. But on the other hand, I think we need to understand that when a large portion of a community moves from one location to the other, we can't expect that the same amount, plus all the children that were born, will move back once the conflict ends. Because some of them, of course, maybe gain more roots into that location, get married, and all the rest. So therefore, there is always a residual case of Angolans in Zambia, in South Africa, but most of them went back to Angola, just to give you an example of Angola.
Well, don't go away, because we'll be back after the break.
When policies become restrictive, people continue to move, but they do so in an undocumented way. And I think that's where a lot of conflict comes from.
Welcome back to Africa 360. Let's continue with our discussion on migration. And before the break, we talked about migration trends to Europe. Now let's turn our eye to the continent. Despite large numbers of migrants making their way north, research shows that the bulk of African migration takes place on the continent, with exception of North Africa. Proximity and close ties to the former colonizer means that 90% of North African migrants leave Africa. The figures drop considerably elsewhere on the continent, from 41% in East Africa to as little as 24% of West African migrants leaving the continent. Well, our panel of guests are still with me, and let's pack some of those trends we are seeing in intra-African migration. So from the graphic we've just seen, the bulk of African migration takes place within the continents. Why is that so?
Well, some of it is about ease of movement. It's far easier to travel shorter distances than longer distances. Some of it is also about migration control regimes. It's much more difficult to migrate across the sea to Europe than it is to move within your region. It also is about the push factors for migration. For example, in southern Africa, what's most striking about migration is the extent of circular migration. People are not immigrating forever. What they want to do is move across borders on a regular basis. And so that wouldn't make Europe a logical choice for those kinds of migrants.
Are African governments more tolerant to migrants than, let's say, the West?
I wouldn't. I mean, without having statistical data, and perhaps Ingrid can help me there with the data, but the anti-migrant sentiment is not different from one region of Africa to another region of Africa, or from Africa to Asia. Perhaps it gains more highlight in the news with the crossing on the Mediterranean than in a movement in a movement within the region. On the other hand, you look at the different flows. For instance, from the Horn of Africa, you have the northbound flow, which is to Europe, but you have southbound flow, and the number of people that lose their life moving from the Horn of Africa to Southern Africa it is also significant that we shouldn't ignore.
Ingrid, let's talk more about Africans tolerating other Africans. 2008, we saw xenophobic attacks here in South Africa. They're still going on at a much lesser scale in South Africa. If we look at Kenya, we look at the way Somalis are treated in the country as well. Just comment on this, how Africans treat other African migrants.
Yes, well, it's been a significant problem, and South Africa and Kenya have been in the spotlight on this, but in other countries as well. And I think it's a part of the broad perception that migration is always a negative thing. And yet there are examples across the world of where smart policy making has resulted in the benefits of migration really coming to the fore. And I think it's very difficult. What we've done in South Africa in particular and in Southern Africa is increasingly develop restrictive policies. And what that means, not just for us but across the world, is that when policies become restrictive, people continue to move, but they do so in an undocumented way. And I think that's where a lot of conflict comes from. It means people settle among the poor, compete with the poor, etc., rather than having a migration policy that can pull out the positives of migration and make sure, of course, that any negative activities like smuggling and so on are curbed at the same time.
And that brings Rwanda to mind. They have a national migration policy, which has been welcomed by some thinkers because basically the country is trying to woo in skilled workers, increase investment and tourism in the country. Would you applaud Rwanda for these measures?
Certainly, and we've been working with a number of governments in the region as well to really have a migration policy, including South Africa. When the Immigration Act, I mean, when I was part of a roundtable discussion on that, I said, let's talk about a migration policy. It's not just about migrants coming to South Africa, also it's about South Africans leaving the country. So what policy the government needs to have to make sure that the government maximizes the benefits of migration. But also to bring the other dimension. We talk a lot about the migrants, we talk about the death at sea, and we forget to actually address some of, especially on the smuggling networking. We forget to address the criminal justice side of the whole crisis on migration. So, and who is getting richer in the whole this process are the smugglers, and who is dying are the migrants. So I think we need to really start to be more comprehensive on how do we address this issue, including the criminal justice side, which includes the smuggling networks.
How do you begin tackling that?
Well, I mean, it is a criminal justice issue, as my colleague said, and so you know, it's if you take, for example, the South Africa-Zimbabwean border as an illustration, that's one where there are smuggling networks, and it's not really a huge secret who they are. It has lacked a coordinated criminal justice response, and so it is possible to tackle that. I also think that if we facilitate people's access to movement, the positive aspects of movement that do exist, then it won't be necessary for them to rely on corrupt and often dangerous smuggling networks.
Well, let's take a look at the top 6 destinations for African immigrants. As you can see, former colonizer France attracts 9% of immigrants, followed closely by Ivory Coast and then South Africa. The United States and the United Kingdom wrap up the top 6. What would the push factors for Ivory Coast be? I would have thought a country like Nigeria in West Africa would have more people from the West African region moving into that country.
It could also be associated with language, and there is, of course, the traditional movement of people that speak the same language in terms of indigenous languages, right? So Ivory Coast is more attractive, also because of the opportunity it brings to the migrants in terms of a better life.
Don't go away, because after the break we'll take a look at the often strained relationship between South Africa and Zimbabwean immigrants.
Any attempt to blanketly deport people falls afoul of South Africa's own obligations towards human rights and even international obligations as well.
Welcome back. Today we're looking at migration trends here in Africa. The relationship between South Africa and Zimbabwean immigrants has often been strained. Zimbabweans with valid documents to stay in South Africa had until last month to apply for a new permit, but the application process has had many Zimbabweans up in arms. Let's take a look at the latest developments. In 2009, the South African government embarked on the dispensation of Zimbabweans project, a special permit that would legalize the status of Zimbabweans working, studying, or operating businesses in South Africa. Last December, these permits expired. Permit holders are required to reapply. But the process has been criticized for being complex and cumbersome and could only be completed online. Government has threatened those who fail to apply for the correct papers with deportation from South Africa, a move that advocacy group Zimbabwe Exiles Forum says it will challenge. The Zimbabwean Special Dispensation Permit will be discontinued in 2017. Thereafter, Zimbabweans, like other foreign nationals, will be required to return home to apply for mainstream visas and permits under the Immigration Act. Despite many complaints about the special permit application process, Department of Home Affairs spokesperson Maitlome Shwete says they are now satisfied with how things have gone.
Well, we feel very happy about the improvements that we are doing in terms of ports of entries, and we feel very happy about the improvements to the systems in terms of the special permits application process. I think this has been handled a lot better than the one that was in 2009. Which had long queues, and we had fights breaking out in queues. This one was internet-based system, and it was done quite well.
And I'm still joined by Professor Palmary, and also joining us in this segment is Zimbabwean human rights lawyer Gabriel Shumba. Gabriel, thanks very much for joining us, and I'll start with you. A lot of Zimbabweans here in the diaspora in South Africa said this whole process was cumbersome and that it was very difficult for them to make their applications on time. How do you respond to this?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that this was an online process and not everybody's computer savvy. That means that a whole bunch of people were excluded from the process, those that did not have the requisite skills to do the application online. And secondly, if you look at even the system itself is set up by Home Affairs. It was very difficult to access the application form online during the first days. But that's not all. If you look at the centers where the people are now supposed to be interviewed, they have been limited and reduced in number from those that we had had in 2010 during the Zimbabwe documentation project. So that was another limitation which still remains an issue for concern for many Zimbabweans. But I think you could also say that the other problem has been actually to do with Home Affairs itself and its failure to keep its books in order. If you look at the current application process, it requires that you have a reference number from the Zimbabwe documentation project in 2010. Many centers failed to provide those numbers, and we have had several cases of people complaining that they can't access those reference numbers. And if you don't have that reference number, you can't apply online. And what is pathetic about the situation is that if you go back to the center where you applied, the file is missing. So those are some, but not, the entire concern that we have about the process.
Ingrid, your thoughts on his sentiments on Home Affairs actually making it a bit difficult for the Zimbabweans to apply for their renewal?
Well, I think it speaks to a more general problem within the Department of Home Affairs, which has been poor and maladministration. This has been one example where we've seen that where a policy might have potential and might be relatively useful, our ability to administer and manage it is quite low. And it's not just this process that has been plagued by those administrative difficulties.
Which other processes?
Well, for example, the asylum system generally has had endless problems with corruption, with missing files, with those kinds of difficulties.
We've been hearing this for years on years. So hasn't there been any improvement?
Not really, no. Not within the asylum system. I can't speak to the details of the new Zimbabwean process. My colleague will be better.
I think you might want to know that as we are speaking, there are people being turned away from the border. A host of those that had gone for the holidays at the encouragement of the minister, who said those that can at least show that they have applied can go to Zimbabwe during the holidays and come back. A lot of them are being turned away. Others are being given 5 days to come into the country and pack their things and go back. So it speaks of a discrepancy between policy and practice on the ground. And I think that is one of the things that is awfully inadequate about Home Affairs and its management of the system.
So now all those who missed this 31st December deadline and may decide to go underground, is there any chance you think that they could actually regularize their immigration status?
Well, the chance is there if Home Affairs would open up discussions with stakeholders, because if you remember, during the ZDP and currently now under the Zimbabwe Special Permit, we have got what is known as the Stakeholders Forum of Civil Society Organizations engaging with Home Affairs over this. We think that it is prudent at this juncture to call for a post-mortem or a review meeting of the process so that all the challenges can be addressed, because we are talking of over 45,000 people that currently stand excluded. And it is very, I think, dishonest and hypocritical for anybody to claim that they have chosen not to renew their permits. That is simply not true.
Now, all those who obviously didn't renew their permits by the 31st of December will be deported from the country. In your view, is deportation the answer to this problem?
Well, I'm not sure that deportation is the answer, and I'm not even sure that they will be deported. It takes massive resources to run a deportation program. So what we see in South Africa is a situation where police are spending large amounts of their time checking documents, which is perhaps not, should not be a policing priority in a country like South Africa. We also see enormous resources being spent on deportation processes, and it's unclear whether they have any impact. So we do need a conversation about the best strategy, because deportation is often a solution that is both expensive and detracts resources from other places where they might be better used.
And I think if you just to come in, Professor, you could also even say that any attempt to blanketly deport people falls afoul of South Africa's own obligations towards human rights and even international obligations as well. Each case must be viewed in its own merit. So it's unhelpful for anybody to say that we'll start carrying out blanket deportations, because then that puts South Africa's human rights record on in the region and on the continent in jeopardy.
Now, Gabriel, obviously your organization has been in discussion with government about this post-December the 31st. What exactly are they saying to you?
Well, there has been a bit of adamancy in terms of even reconvening a meeting of the stakeholders. They are saying that the process has come and gone. We are now processing the applications and there is no need for the stakeholders to meet. We have hinted, I don't want to use the term warning, but we have hinted that we might be compelled to approach the courts if the position remains the same, because there are a lot of people with grievances out there, and a review of the administrative action taken by Home Affairs might be in order before the courts if the position remains the same. So we hope to continue to encourage them to engage again and to find a permanent solution to this problem.
Well, we will keep an eye on this story as it develops. And that brings us to the end of this week's edition of Africa 360. And if you'd like to add your voice to the discussion on the issues raised, do visit our Facebook page or tweet us at Africa360_ENCA. You can also send your emails to Africa360@enca.com. Thanks for watching and goodbye for now.